Welcome to this information video on how to correctly set rent levels if you are a landlord in a rent pressure zone. It is vitally important that you do this when you increase rent when your property is in a rent pressure zone. Failure to do this correctly could lead you to being non-compliant with Ireland's rental laws. I hope you will find this information session helpful, and if you have any queries after the session, please check our website for some valuable resources on how to manage the process correctly. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Emer, the Head of Compliance and Enforcement in the Residential Tenancies Board. I'm here today to tell you about setting a rent correctly in a rent pressure zone. So what is a rent pressure zone? A rent pressure zone is an area where rent can only be increased once a year and the amount of rent increase is limited. RPZs are areas where rents are at the highest and are rising quickly. They aim to moderate the rise in rents, create a stable and sustainable rental market that allows landlords and tenants to plan financially for their future. How much can I increase the rent in an RPZ? Since 2022, landlords can increase the rent once per year by either the rate of inflation, the HICP, or by 2%, whichever is the lowest. The HICP is the Harmonised Index of Consumer Prices. The RPZ calculator examines the percentage difference, if any, in the HICP rate since the rent was last set. This percentage difference may be below 2%, depending on when the rent review is conducted. If it's above 2%, the rent increase is capped at 2%. Setting the rent in an RPZ. Rent can only be reviewed once every 12 months. The RPZ calculator is the best way to ensure your rent increase is correct. Landlords must give tenants at least 90 days notice of the new rent. This means serving a new rent review on the tenant at least 90 days before the date when the new rent will take effect. Use the Notice of Rent Review form available on the RTB website, and be aware any changes to the format or the wording can invalidate the form. Landlords should also make sure that they update the rent amount on their RTB account. So to set the rent correctly in RPZ, always use the RPZ calculator to make sure that it's correct. The calculator is accessible from our website at rtb.ie. So when you click on the calculator, it brings you into the rent pressure zone calculator. The first thing to do is to check if the tenancy address is in an RPZ. So to do this, you type the address of the tenancy or the area code into the text box. For this example, I've used a public building, but you can use the tenancy address or the area code. Once you find your address, the calculator will confirm the tenancy address, confirm if it's in an RPZ, and tell you the date that it became an RPZ. Different areas were designated RPZs at different times, so this will impact on the rent amount calculated by the calculator. So next, enter the current rent amount and the date the rent was last set, and the date the new rent is being set. For this example, I've picked a date in August, but you would be entering the day that you're doing the rent review. The calculator will then give you the HICP percentage change. In this example, you can see that the rate is below 2% at 1.6%. So this is the rate of rent increase allowed. The calculator will provide the HICP index table. This shows you the difference between the HICP value on the date the rent was previously set, in this example July 2023, and the HICP value that applies on the date the rent review is set. So for this example, that's August 2024. The calculator then shows you a summary of results and provides the maximum rent increase permitted. It also provides the calculation to support this. You can also click on the print icon, and this creates a printout for you to give to tenants. And it also has a link to download the rent review form. I'm now going to take you through serving a rent review and some examples of rent reviews. The Notice of Rent Review must state the new rent and how it's calculated. The rent pressure zone calculator is the best way to ensure that your rent increase is accurate. You should include a printout of the RPZ calculator with the Notice of Rent Review, and both are available to download from the RPZ calculator. We recommend that you check your calculations for any rent increase on the same date that you give your Notice of Rent Review to the tenants. And this is because the HICP rate may change on a regular basis, so as to ensure that you have the most accurate calculations for the day you're serving the rent review. If a tenant believes that the rent review is inaccurate, they can apply for a dispute resolution. This is where an independent adjudicator will review the rent review and validate it. So, reviewing a rent in an existing tenancy. You can review a rent once a year in an RPZ area. Use the RPZ calculator to ensure that rent increase is correct. So in this example, tenant 1 lived in the property since the 10th of January 2022. On the 10th of January 2023, the landlord carried out a rent review using the RPZ calculator and served the notice of rent review on the tenant. As the landlord must give 90 days notice, the new rent will only apply from the 10th of April 2023. This is when the tenant starts to pay the new rent amount. The rent amount should also be updated on the RTB account. The landlord can do the next annual rent review for the same tenancy in January 2024. Setting the rent in a new tenancy. So this is where a tenant leaves the property and new tenants move in. Landlords can do a rent review and are allowed to do pro rata rent increase, so they don't have to wait the year anniversary of the previous rent increase to increase the rent. So for example, tenant 1 lived in the property since January 2022. The rent was reviewed in January 2023 and increased in line with RPZ rules. Tenant 1 moved out in June 2023 and the landlord relet the property. The landlord should end the old tenancy on the RTB account. The landlord can conduct a rent review at the start of the new tenancy in June 2023. The RPZ calculator should be used to calculate the correct rent increase, especially because it's a pro rata increase. So when the landlord is setting the rent in this new tenancy, they must provide the new tenant with how the rent was set in writing. So to do this, you need to provide the amount the last rent was set for the property, the date the last rent was set, and an RPZ calculator printout showing how the new rent was calculated. You must give this to the tenant at the beginning of all tenancies in an RPZ, even when there's an RPZ exemption. When the new tenancy begins, you must register it with the RTB and provide details on the new tenants and the new rent amount. So buying a property to rent. When buying a property to rent out, the new owner must first find out if the property has been rented previously. If it was rented in the 2 years before you buy it, you must find out, number 1, the previous rent amount, secondly, the date the last rent was set, and thirdly, the date the tenants vacated. If you cannot get this information from the selling agent, the RTB can share the last rent details with you once you send us proof of purchase. If you do not find out this information and you set the rent incorrectly, you could be liable for a sanction. So when you're buying a property to rent, for example, a landlord buys a vacant property in June 2023. The selling agent knows that there was a previous tenancy but does not know the rent amount. The landlord contacts the RTB and provides proof that they are the new owner. The RTB tells the landlord that there was a tenancy in the property until January 2023. The last rent was €2,000 and it was set in January 2022. So when the landlord sets the rent in the new tenancy, he must use the RPZ calculator to set the new rent, using January 2022 as the date the last rent is set. They must give the new tenants the information in writing. Firstly, the last rent set for the property, the date the rent was last set, and an RPZ calculator printout showing how the new rent was calculated. When the new tenancy begins, the landlord must register with the RTB within 1 month of when the tenancy begins. There are some exemptions to RPZs. Some properties are exempt from RPZ rent increase rules. These are a property that has not been rented for 2 years before the new tenancy start date, a property that is a protected or proposed protected structure and has not been rented for 12 months before the new tenancy start date, or a property that has undergone substantial change in the nature of accommodation. There are strict rules about substantial change means, so it's important that landlords check out the information on the RTB's website around this. If a property is exempt, you must send an exemption form and supporting documents to the RTB, and more information is available on our website about this. Just to recap on setting the rent in an RPZ. First of all, check if you're in an RPZ. You can only review the rent once per year in an RPZ. Calculate the new rent using the RPZ calculator. This is important to make sure that your calculations are correct. Complete the notice of rent review and give it to your tenant at least 90 days before the new rent is to take effect. And if your property is exempt of RPZ rules, send an RPZ exemption form to the RTB within 1 month of giving notice of rent review to your tenants. And finally, inform the RTB of the new rent within 1 month of it taking effect by changing the rent amount on your RTB account. Thank you for listening. For more information, please visit our website or contact us on the numbers visible on screen.